Good evening, it's Brennan Johnson with the Digital Liberation Front. Tonight, we're with author Frank Reider and his book, Can't Get No Satisfaction. Welcome to the show, Frank.
Hi, it's great to be here.
Good to have you, good to have you. I've read a couple chapters of the book. I have not finished it, but the first couple chapters were extremely intriguing, especially considering everything that's going on right now when it comes to pushing back against, the government in regard to, our rights. Tell me a bit about why you wrote this book.
Well, there are a number of reasons why. Number one, I have 5 children and 10 grandchildren. And a couple of my children who had recorded my stories about civil rights they were writing papers on it, and they used it as firsthand commentary. They felt that it was a book that should be written. They encouraged me to do that. And in addition, all of my kids said, yeah, we want to have this for our family, for your 10 grandkids and the ones that come after. So that was the initial motivation. And as I got into it, and I read a lot more about the history of slavery in the United States and the effects that it has until today, I felt it was really important to lay all of this out. And so it's a combination of a family motive as well as a historical motive, along with talking about race today. I talk a lot about, I don't know if you got to any of that, but I talk a lot about race today.
You talk a lot about race. And it's interesting how the voice of the book follows, it's basically you recounting, these anecdotes about these experiences, these historical experiences, so these personal anecdotes from a firsthand perspective. You talk a little bit about, working with other young lawyers and, going down to the South and, actually having a conference, where you spoke with Martin Luther King. Can you tell me a bit about that moment? Tell me a bit about what that was like?
Well, it was very short. It wasn't like we had a conversation. Yeah, I was in an orientation program for legal interns. The organization was called Law Student Civil Rights Research Council. It started in 1963. I recounted in the book its origins and everything. And so in 1965, when I went down there, we had an orientation program in Atlanta. And Martin Luther King came, gave a speech about how important the legal action is in the civil rights movement, that he talked about that it's sometimes slower than we would like, but ultimately it gets the right thing done, and it's key. And obviously the Voting Rights Act of 64, the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights 65 were really important at the time. However, historically, blacks already had those rights.
Mm-hmm.
And what's really interesting is, for instance, in 1890, Louisiana had 130,000 blacks registered to vote. 130,000. That's 1890, where the population was a lot less than it was in the 60s or today. In 1896, the Supreme Court handed down one of its, what I call, white supremacist decisions, which legalized separate but equal. In so doing, it encouraged the South to go back, as they were already doing after the Reconstruction, but it accelerated even more. So as I said, 1890, 130,000 in Louisiana. In 1901, barely a little over 1,000 people. So they got rid of all of those by putting in tests, making requirements for identification, all kinds of different stuff that people weren't able to get together in time. A lot of them blacks wouldn't be able to get certain documents, period. So there was civil rights was trying to accomplish in the 60s and subsequently what really already existed in the past and was overcome by the white supremacist kind of decisions, Dred Scott and Plessy versus Ferguson, those kind of things that really backtracked. made it worse than it was before the Civil War, in many
I,
respects.
I want to come back to that, but I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves because I want to talk about your origin, how you got into this. What made you so driven in regard to the civil rights movement? Because at the beginning of the book, you talk about your high school experiences and really not being that politically aware until you hit college.
Right.
So tell me a bit about what drew you to this material. What kind of I guess like radicalized you in regard to wanting to become more civilly engaged, from a legal perspective.
Right. So yeah, basically, when I graduated from high school, I only knew that the newspaper had sports pages. And when I got to college, I went to a very small, highly intellectual college where sports were secondary. We had sports, but they were secondary. And and I was elected for some weird reason to the college, the student senate in my first semester there in my freshman year. And there were lots of issues that were vibrating: the beginning of the Vietnam War, uh, the economic ban on Cuba that Kennedy put in, and how should we treat Cuba? And there was a big movement on campus that it should be fair play for Cuba, whereas Kennedy and much more conservative people wanted total isolation for Cuba, and which is ultimately what he implanted. So I had to read about this stuff. I had to go to the library, read the newspapers every day, discover the other sections of the New York Times and the local papers, and I became aware of what was going on. And as civil rights became more and more important, I had friends who went down to Mississippi during the summertime while between my freshman and sophomore year and my sophomore and junior, and then junior and senior. And I wanted to go down, but I ended up not going down. So when I went to law school, there I was very concerned. I wanted to do something, and this Law Student Civil Rights Council became something that a lot of law students were interested in. And I only found out a little late, but I was able to get a location in Tallahassee, working for a black civil rights lawyer, and John Dew was his name, and he's very prominent in the book, and he was a prominent black lawyer. There were very, very few in the 60s in northern Florida, very few. He was based in Tallahassee, which is where my base was, and so it was an evolving kind of experience to become interested. But by the time I had graduated from college, I was very, very upset with the fact that we had so many states that were totally segregated. Plus, in recollection, in New York, I didn't have a lot of black friends. It was mostly from sports teams. And for whatever reason, we didn't socialize. And so, I never thought about it really in high school. I thought about it a lot more in college. And to say that my college was predominantly white was an understatement. We had very few black students, some outstanding black students, but very few. So anyway, at law school, it was a little different. We had a number of black students. Anyway, that's what got me down to Tallahassee in 1965, summer 65.
And when you went down there, that was after some young. It was like two Jewish activists and one black activist.
Right.
They'd been murdered in the South.
1964, exactly a year after I went down. Right.
And so, what was it like in the shadow of that? Like, going down to this this extremely segregated atmosphere where you knew death was, an option based off of, what had happened before in the environment and the people that you were around.
I had a meeting with in St. Augustine last year with a civil rights leader named Jimmy Jackson, and we were talking about our experiences. He's more or less the same age as I am, and he was very active in St. Augustine in civil rights. And I said, no, I'm looking back as I wrote this book, and I wasn't afraid. I wasn't afraid. It wasn't that I was brave. I just wasn't afraid. He said, you know what it is, Frank? When you're 22 and you're doing the right thing,
Mm.
you don't think anything's going to happen to you. he got beat up a lot. I never got beat up. I was pushed and shoved, but it was never anything serious. And so I was very fortunate because I was in a lot of situations that in fact, were dangerous. But I never had anything serious. But I wasn't afraid. I don't know if you've gotten to the part of the beach incidents in St. Augustine, but that was written up in the local newspapers. There were tons of racist guys with guns, with bats. You know, while we went to the beach, it's a long story on that one, but and you know, I felt cool. I was totally normal, let's say, under those circumstances. Today, I'd be scared out of my mind, but
Hmm.
back then, I don't know what it was, but I wasn't, and did what I had to do.
I mean, I guess it's a different place. I mean, you mentioned it, in jest, but yeah, I mean, today it is a different ball game. I'm sure you've been following the circumstances, in Portland whenever Trump sent in, his special police force to augment the police force there and escalate violence, and then they ended up leaving. And then also the situation that happened in Washington D.C., where Trump cleared out a plaza in front of a church for a photo opportunity. What? How has the civil rights movement, or the fight for civil rights changed in this new era where it seems like there's more authoritarian, more fascist behavior taking place in our own government?
Yeah, well, first of all, in the '60s, which is what we're talking about, there was no chance of a racist being prosecuted for beating somebody up or killing somebody or shooting into a house or a car. It just didn't happen. I'd like to talk to you about police, if you like, whenever you want to. But it's a key part of my book, and it's a key part of my thinking of what's going on today in the country. It's fundamental. My thoughts on this as to why it's happening. It's not pure racism. It's racism, but it's not only racism. There's a lot of other factors involved.
Well, I'm willing to pick your brain on that if you want to share some
Okay,
tidbits of that. I'm open for that
so
discussion.
let's go. So number one, um, people in the police departments. Okay, almost always, the smaller the town, okay, obviously in a city like New York or San Francisco or Los Angeles, it's different. But most of the time, most of the police are local. They come from the town, and when it's a small town, or surrounding towns when it's something like Minneapolis. Okay, so they reflect the mores, okay, of a certain level of people. Most, I would say, very few police officers graduate from college. There are some who want to be professionals, who are dedicated to being policemen and have studied, gone all the way through college. But most of them, at best, are high school, and frequently, and especially in the smaller areas, lots of them don't even finish high school. So they number one, so they're part of the local mores. In the '60s, in the South, the local mores was totally racist. I mean, totally racist. You had exceptions, but they were clear exceptions, and they weren't outspoken. Local people weren't that were not racist or were against racism frequently weren't outspoken. Like when I went to the beach, there was a woman lying on her towel, a white woman, local white woman lying on her towel, and she said, "Just let them go to the beach. It's a beach. Who cares?" You know. So there were people who felt that way, but the vast majority didn't, and they intimidated the people who felt that way to keep quiet. So that's number one. So they don't have education, and they reflect the local mores. Let me just see what else I had here. Another thing is that the sheriffs and the police chiefs are elected and subject to being elected again or voted out of office. So if the vast majority of people are racist and they put a racist in jail for doing something that the vast majority of people think is okay to do, they're not going to be reelected. So that pressure, even if they were inclined to do something, which was rare, very rarely would they ever actually go ahead and do it.
So this is how. So they are literally voting racism into the system. This is literally making the arbiter of the law basically in alignment with racist policy.
Right. In 1964, the sheriff for St. Augustine, who was totally racist, he campaigned on not having blacks vote for him. He would go through the black area of St. Augustine, called Lincolnville, which is back then was where most blacks lived. And he would, on his megaphone, would be shouting, "Nigger, don't vote for me. Nigger, don't vote for me," throughout the whole town. And so that generated all the people who were racist that, yeah, that's our guy. And he won something like 70% of the vote in St. Johns County, which is St. Augustine, the seat of. In 2018, the Democrats had a black candidate for governor who lost by a fraction of a percent the present governor, which was a very questionable. The whole thing was very questionable. Anyway, he lost by a fraction of a percent. In St. Johns County, which St. Augustine is the seat of, 72% went against the Democrat for the Republican. So in other words, I'm not saying that everybody, you can have a Republican who's not racist. I'm not saying they're all racist, but having a similar voting pattern from the 60s, where it was obviously racism, to today is something I find disconcerting at the very least. That when for instance, Martin Luther King is an example. He had a house in St. Augustine for the campaign 1964, which was key to getting the Voting Rights Act passed. And his house was shot into multiple times and firebombed once. He wasn't in there when it happened. And the sheriff never even investigated. They never even sent somebody out to make believe that they cared about it. Okay. And so back then, there was absolutely no repression in any way, not even an appearance of repression to people who are violating the law. I mean, they're trying to kill somebody. They're shooting at people. They're shooting at cars. They're beating people up. They beat up Andrew Young in front of the police chief. The police chief did nothing. So there's no inhibitions. They do whatever they want. And then when you put on top of that everyone was nonviolent. So all these guys knew that if they punched somebody, they weren't going to get punched back. So the courage that's required to confront those risks is monumental. There's no way to even describe how scary it was to go in being nonviolent. And the guy in my book that I use as an example, which was written before he passed away, was John Lewis. For me, he is the symbol of courage in the history of our country. It's hard to beat John Lewis for courage.
I agree. John Lewis definitely had a bunch of.
He went into sit-ins. Yeah, we all know about Selma, and that was unbelievable. But he would go into a sit-in in a all-white luncheonette and get beaten up like crazy, and the police wouldn't stop it. Now, sometimes you have the police stop it, but not arrest anybody. But they'd say, "Okay, that's enough." But if they said, "Okay, that's enough," most of the time people would stop beating people up. Most of the time, not always, but most of the time. But frequently, they would never say, "Stop it," and they would be witnesses to the beatings and never charge anybody. And so today, let's take that background and go to today. So you have cops who are from the local area that is basically segregated, de facto segregation. In other words, people live together, blacks live together, whites live together. And so you don't have a lot of interaction except on sports teams. So if you don't have sports teams, okay, because it's not a segregated school, it's an integrated school, but on a personal level, people are associating with them, the people that they know that are basically the same. Exceptions, there's always exceptions, many more exceptions today than there was in the 60s, without any question. But the fact is that guys that took care of Floyd, I guarantee you, don't have black friends. don't have interaction. The other thing is Floyd is was a big black, strong guy. Okay. And everything that big black symbolizes, okay, on all levels, he had. The other guys are short. Everything they had was small. All that psychology, okay, causes this kind of friction. And they were afraid to arrest this guy. He was big. He could beat the hell out of them if he wanted to. He clearly didn't want to. You could see the interaction. He was afraid. He had no intention whatsoever of being violent. He did nothing that was violent. His hands were tied behind his back by the handcuffs from the very, very beginning. Okay. And he was afraid he was going to die. And he was right to be afraid, obviously, you know. And these guys, I mean, they murdered him. I don't see how anyone could look at this and not say that he wasn't murdered. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, you're talking about minutes, like 8 minutes in broad daylight with people watching. That
right. And the thing is, though, that a number of these cops had multiple incidents similar to this. Okay. And they never were reprimanded. So there was nothing that they had to be afraid of. Nothing caused them to think twice about what they were doing. Nothing, ever. Just had the difference is that now we have phones and we're recording it, and you're seeing all the stuff that's been happening forever that's on television now. And even so, you still have that killing in Atlanta of a guy who was in the Wendy's. He was totally peaceful. It was absurd what those cops did, even after Floyd and even after all these things are on television, which they have to be aware of, you know?
Well, I mean, that brings me to, you know, you talked a little bit about nonviolence and John Lewis and Martin Luther King and the bravery there. But then you also spoke about, you know, Stokely Carmichael and the Black Panther Party for self-defense and how they got a bad label because of their embrace of violence. As a matter of fact, you stated Stokely Carmichael stated that nonviolence was, you know, a white invention. You want to expand upon that idea a little bit and juxtapose your perceptions of both in that time frame?
So Stokely Carmichael was one of the most interesting people in the civil rights movement. He was close with Martin Luther King. He replaced John Lewis as the head of SNCC, Nonviolent Committee. And so the name of the organization was Nonviolent in their name. Okay.
Yeah, it was a student nonviolent coordinating committee, correct?
Correct. And it became probably the most important organization for young people that were coming in, young black people principally, but young people coming in. And I admired them a lot. But John Lewis was the original guy there. And Stokely Carmichael took over either the end of 67, beginning of 68. 1968, James Meredith desegregated the University of Mississippi. And every time he would go in, he needed guards and everything else. And one day he was shot. Stokely Carmichael ran down there. He gave really a speech that changed everything. In this one, he gave the fist for Black Power. He said, "We're not Negroes, or either Afro Americans or blacks. That's what we are. That's our color. That's who we are. We're blacks." And Martin Luther King never accepted term black. He called it unfortunate. It's in my book. Called it an unfortunate term. But then, of course, he was assassinated in that same 1968. So he never had a chance to digest it really and perhaps change his mind. But that was key. That changed everything.
So Martin Luther King took issue with the label black, and he wanted to retain the label of being Negro. Is that what you're speaking about?
Yeah, no doubt about that. That's a fact. It's not an opinion. Fact. And gradually, with his death, with Stokely Carmichael's incredible speeches that he gave over and over, blacks started to call themselves black and not Negroes. And I use Negroes, black, African Americans interchangeably in my book because we're in the 60s. And so I use the book. Obviously, when we talk about today, I don't use the term Negro. I mean, nonviolence was really important. John Lewis felt nonviolence was the way to go until he died. He felt that was made the most dramatic sense, let's say, to emphasize the wrongs that he was fighting. And a lot to say for that. Now, for instance, when I went to the beach in St. Augustine, there was a kid my age, 22, more or less, who organized it. And he said, he warned me, he said, I'm not nonviolent. I'm not nonviolent. I'm not nonviolent. And he kept telling me that. I said, okay. So I said, I'm not the one who's going to decide if I'm going. I'm here to work on a particular case, so-called suicide in the county jail that I was investigating. And I was working for Mrs. Plummer, who was a nurse at our hospital and a civil rights leader, one of the two major local civil rights leaders. She says we're going to go, I'm going. Not, I won't. We went, and it's a long story. It's all in the book. Fascinating story, by the way. And we were the only men. Everybody else there were kids or women, and that was scary. And the other thing is, when you have a bunch of black people and one white guy, all the racist things, the white guy is the boss. That's what they think of it. And I made it clear I wasn't. I told the cops I wasn't the boss. I work for her. I do what she tells me. If she wants to stay, I'm staying. If she wants to leave, I'm leaving. And they would snicker and sneer and say I'm faking it and everything, but it was the fact. It was what it was. Anyway, so that's that. I don't know what I wanted to say about police. So today you have these people who are afraid, intimidated by blacks, even if they're not as big as Floyd. Like another guy in Mississippi who happened to be one white guy and one black guy that killed people needlessly. Two cops that killed people needlessly. One guy, a famous guy, was on Facebook. His girlfriend was driving. He was in the car. He kept his hands visible and said he did have a gun, but he wasn't going to use it. And the cop out of nowhere just started shooting at him and killed him. That was a white. And then there was the black cop who shot.
That was Philando Castile.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And that was a horrible story.
Yeah.
Horrible story. And he wasn't prosecuted, to my knowledge. He wasn't prosecuted.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the thing that is so important, is that you don't prosecute people for doing these horrendous things, horrendous killings, needless killings. There are a lot of killings where you don't know if it's really needless, but you can see it that it was needless. The guy wasn't doing anything. There's no reason to shoot the guy, and he killed him, shot him multiple times. That's the other thing. They don't shoot once or twice. They unload all their guns, and sometimes the 3 or 4 cops unload all the guns. What's the point of that? That's got to be racist. Got to be fear of the black man when they do something like that. Fear of the black man.
The more nonviolent wing was appealing to something when it came to the public in regard to change. That was the main reason why John Lewis, and the members of SNCC, these individuals who would go to, ice cream parlors, restaurants and sit down, demand service, and then be spat upon, be beat, be attacked with clubs, dogs, fire hoses. They were always show up dressed up, and they were never ever violent in response to the attacks that they were receiving, because they were trying to appeal to the greater nature of humanity, and not just within the United States, but around the globe, basically by stating that if these individuals see us, if people see us in this form, in our best, being treated as the worst, then there will be an outcry for change.
Correct.
What do you feel about that psychology now? Do you feel like that greater appeal can be made?
Well, things are a little different now. There's a big question, for instance, is the Black Lives Matter protest nonviolent or violent? Because you had violence in there. My opinion, which is subjective, it's not based on absolute facts. There's no way to have absolute facts. is that there are rioters going in there to make it look like Black Lives Matter protests are violent, but I think they're basically nonviolent. And I think that the more nonviolent they are, the more that the issues they're raising comes to the fore. The more violence there is, robbing, looting, stuff like that, people start focusing, and principally people who aren't sympathetic perhaps to the Black Lives Matter movement, and say all lives matter and all that kind of stuff. They are able to focus on the looting and not on the issues that Black Lives Matter is raising. So I think definitely nonviolence in this particular case is the way to go. Now, don't forget that, in theory at least, you don't have any violence against them, except like Charlottesville or a couple of other incidents now where you had people coming out, and in Georgia you had where they were protesting against some of the Confederate statues and monuments. You had people coming out to say, we're going to protect those monuments. You can't tear them down, kind of thing. So there was a little bit of violence there, and that's unfortunate. So every time you have violence, issues that the Black Lives Movement wants to raise is overshadowed by the violence. So I think it's pretty clear for me anyway that violence is not good, and nonviolence works, still continues to work. I'll tell you that I think it's really interesting. It's Black Panthers. You mentioned that earlier, and I mentioned it in my book. My roommate at law school went in to work at a DA's office, and he maintains until today that Black Panthers were violent, used violence as a means of getting their ends. And my experience with Black Panthers, and I had a lot of experience in 1965 with Black Panthers, and let me tell you, it was nice to have them there. I would be within a demonstration, sometimes as a lawyer and sometimes as a demonstrator. I should say a legal assistant, not a lawyer, because I wasn't a lawyer. But there were scary times. And the Black Panthers were big, strong, and organized, but they only used violence for protection, in my opinion. Now there are other people who have different points of view. Black Panthers had social programs in Oakland and Chicago and other cities, but those two were major, feeding poor people, starting local schools. They had lots of social programs that were excellent, but they were always overshadowed by the fact that they were big, black, and armed. Okay? That scared people. And regardless of whether they were violent or not, it scared people. Okay? People get scared of big black guys, even when they're not violent people. When they're notoriously nonviolent, they still get scared. And there's a whole psychology there that's concerning. Okay, but anyway, I thought the Black Panthers were fabulous.
Same time, too, you're acknowledging the fact that during the civil rights movement, the Black Panthers were heavily armed, and some of the first gun control laws were implemented in response to the Black Panther Party, because these individuals saw that there were individuals in the government that saw people of color with more firearms, and saw, and like you said, they had that fear, and they wanted to stop
But
it.
they all had permission to have those guns, all of them.
Exactly.
None of them were illegal. That was one of the rules that the Black Panthers had. Everyone had to have a registered firearm.
Gotcha. So, in your book, what is the most prominent story that stands out to you? Well, what do you think the book encompasses as far as your personal experiences? What is the one that stands out the most?
Well, there are a few themes in the book. For instance, the history of slavery. Just give you a couple. I don't know if you got to this in your reading, but some shocking things for me that most people don't know, except people who've read the book or who have talked to me about it. But so Monticello was where Thomas Jefferson lived, and was one of the magnificent colonial architectural constructions that the country had. And number one, the only people that lived there after his wife died and his kids grew up, were slaves and himself. But that's aside. He didn't have the money to build Monticello. He couldn't build it out of his pocket. He had to borrow money, just like you borrow money to buy a house today. He borrowed money to build Monticello. And the guarantee he gave to banks, so the banks demanded a guarantee that they could call on if he didn't pay back the loan. There were 150 slaves. So I don't know if you want to call that, maybe it's probably a 30 or $40 million construction today. He gave 150 slaves in guarantee, just like you would give a piece of land in guarantee, or deposits in a bank in guarantee. He gave 150 slaves. They were nominal slaves. It wasn't say, I have 150 of you. No, it was slave number one, slave number two, to 150. To me, that's shocking that slaves had this kind of value, and that was the best asset he had to offer a bank to get the loan. To me, that's wow. That's a wow moment for me when I read that. Then number two, in 1860, when the Civil War started, the value of the slaves on the plantation were much greater than the value of the plantations themselves. And the value of the slaves combined in the South was worth 7 times more than the total amount of money in circulation in the country. 7 times more than all of the money. That's what the slaves were worth. And I've seen books, accounting books, just like you have accounting books for companies today, of the slaves, their names, their ages. As soon as someone gave birth, the baby was put in there. He's given a name in the book. Sometimes he didn't even know his name. And then he'd be traded, like the horses are traded. Sometimes a kid would be drinking their mother's milk, and then come in and pull him away because he was sold. He was taken away from his mother, just like you take away a dog or a horse or a cow. This kind of stuff is shocking to me. I mean, it's obviously inhuman. And I wondered how people who were otherwise religious could have treated people like this. Because Thomas Jefferson was religious, and his peers were religious. And he, when he died, he didn't free any of his slaves. How could someone who said we're all created equal could treat people like that? Okay, and I'm an admirer, otherwise, of Thomas Jefferson. He was phenomenal. Okay, you can't. Our whole country, our whole Constitution, everything was based on his thinking. Him and others, but he was fundamental. And so, I studied psychology in college. And my conclusion was that in order for people who owned slaves, initially the colonists, okay, because slavery started right as soon as the colonists got here, okay, to justify the treatment of blacks is to invent that they were not human, they were subhuman. The race was subhuman. That way, it didn't conflict with their moral thoughts of doing to others you would have them do unto you. But you don't do that with a horse. You don't do that with a cow. You don't do that with a black person. That's the way it was. Okay? So they invented this artifice that the whole race was inferior, not human, not equal. And that carried through right up to the beginning of the 20th century legally, not just racist, but legally, that's how they were looked at. Because even after the Civil War, after the Emancipation Proclamation, you had multiple Supreme Court decisions that were white supremacists that didn't recognize equality. And the worst was, of course, separate but equal, was the most famous, legalized segregation, which led to what I said before about registered voters and multiple other problems. And it's right up until today. I mean, I can go through, I don't want to bore anybody, but go right through today of how it's been disequal. And I didn't discuss reparations in my book because I thought it was too inflammatory and would get away from what I was talking about. But you could make an excellent case for reparations. Until today, until you have these prisons in Louisiana and Mississippi, other states in the South, where you have slave labor effectively, and you have people who are there because they had possession of drugs, sometimes only marijuana, sometimes other drugs, but for their own use, not for selling. Vast majority weren't selling drugs, and they're put away for life, or they had 3 times they were convicted of one thing or another and put away for life. And frequently not fairly. Okay? Sometimes they did do those deeds, but didn't merit being put away for life. And so there's a whole union of people, black people, and Brian Stevenson has the most eloquent person on the subject, that are in jail because basically they're black. And basically the judges, the police, prosecutors were all white, all did not know other blacks, did not have relations with blacks, at least not on an equal basis. Sometimes you'll have cops in a police department that are black. But
And it's interesting that you bring up, the issue in regard to being in or having possession of cannabis, because it was recently admitted that Nixon persecuted the civil rights movement using cannabis as, a main motivator for, prosecution and investigation of individuals within the civil rights movement.
Yeah, Edgar Hoover. Right. Yeah. Edgar Hoover was glorious for that.
Thanks for taking the time with me tonight. Frank Reider, Can't Get No Satisfaction. Hopefully, I will have you back on the show again. That's a beautiful book. I'll let you go talk to us real quick, Frank, so we can give you the camera. So show us the book again and tell us about the cover. Bring it in.
Yeah, so I don't know if you read on the inside cover, this picture is a police dog in the back of a police car. Martin Luther King is being taken to be indicted by a grand jury, and they were going to take his testimony as to why he shouldn't be indicted. And they put him in the back of a police car with a dog. No cops. They just put him there to sit there until it was time to take him. Look at that kind of disdain that they treated Martin Luther King with. And in my book, there's an incident of me with one of those German Shepherd, police German Shepherds. It was scary. It was very, very scary. Get to that. You'll enjoy that story.
When I finish the book up, I'm gonna have you back. That's what I want to do. Okay.
Okay. Very good. Carrie too is going to look at it. All
Gotcha.
right.
Thank you so much, Frank.
Nice. Thanks so much. Appreciate it. Bye bye.
Corporation front.
Okay. You got it. Right.